So what we're going to do is we're here to expose it, let people tell their story, and let everybody in the public see the horrors of the court system in Suffolk County, New York.
Long Island Backstory.
Please welcome Jeffrey Deskovic.
Good evening. The energy in the room. Good evening. Okay. All right. So as Gary mentioned, I spent 16 years in prison in New York State for a murder and rape which I did not commit. The wrongful conviction happened in 1990 and was caused by a coerced false confession, prosecutorial misconduct, fraud by the medical examiner, and an inept public defender. Let me break each one of those things down. Okay. So the year is 1990, and I'm 16 years old. The victim is 15, and as it would turn out, the actual perpetrator was 29. So for about 6 weeks, the police played this cat and mouse game with me in which half the time they would talk to me as if I was a suspect, while the other half the time they would pretend like they needed my help to solve the crime. They would say things like, the kids won't talk freely around us, but they will around you. Let us know if you hear any rumors. Stop in from time to time. They would ask me my opinion and then congratulate me on my opinions being correct. They made me the center of attention. They made me feel important. I came from a single-parent household in which my dad was never involved in my life in any capacity, and that really interacted because one of the techniques that the police used was the good cop, bad cop, which is also known as Mutt and Jeff, in which one officer takes on a more aggressive role, whereas his partner pretends to be against what's going on, yet somehow powerless to intervene. So I began to look up to the cop who was pretending to be my friend because I didn't have a father figure. My fantasy childhood career, pre-teenage years, was actually to be a cop. So that, along with my age of 16, was how they were able to pull that absurdity, or pull the wool over my eyes. So eventually, they got me to agree to take a polygraph test by telling me that there was some new information which had come in to the FBI file, and they wanted to share that with me, and that would put me in position to be even more helpful to them. But in order for them to share that with me, I would have to take and pass a polygraph. So help us to help you to help us type of logic. So the next day, rather than report to school, I instead went to the police station. As I mentioned, it was a school day, so neither my mother nor my grandmother with whom I lived, they didn't realize that anything was wrong. They thought I was in school, and so they didn't call around looking for me. They drove me to the town of Brewster, which was in Putnam County, whereas I was a native of Peekskill in Westchester County. So that meant that I couldn't leave anymore on my own. I was totally dependent upon the police. So I had 3 officers there who had traveled with me from Peekskill, but then the polygraphist himself, Putnam County Sheriff's Investigator Daniel Stevens, who was dressed as a civilian, and he never identified himself as a cop. I didn't have an attorney present, and I wasn't given anything to eat the entire time I was there. So before beginning the polygraph, the polygrapher gave me countless cups of coffee in order to get me nervous. That was part of the setup because, of course, the premise of the polygraph is that when a person lies, you'll become nervous, and the nervousness will result in an increased pulse rate, and it's the pulse rate which is actually measured by the machine. Other factors which would lead to an increased pulse rate, though, would be fear and caffeine. So the coffee was part of the setup. So after finishing the coffee routine, he attached me to a polygraph machine, and that's when he launched into his third-degree tactics. So he invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. So as each hour passed, so too did my fear increase in proportion to the time. He kept that up for 6.5 to 7 hours. At the end, he said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the polygraph test result that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." So that really shot my fear through the roof. And at that moment, who should make his grand appearance other than the officer who had been pretending to be my friend? He came in the room and told me that the other cops were going to harm me, that he had been holding them off but couldn't do that any longer, that I would have to help myself. When he added that if I did as they wanted, not only would they stop what they were doing, but that I could go home afterwards, that I was not going to be arrested. Being young, naive, frightened, in fear of my life. I mean, the fact that I didn't know where I was and that nobody else knew where I was either really loomed kind of large in my mind. Being overwhelmed emotionally and psychologically, and then there's the push-pull dynamic, because on one hand there's the possibility of harm, and then on the other hand there's this false life preserver that he threw to me, and I needed something to latch onto. And so I made up a story based on information which they had given me in the course of that interrogation, both that day and in the 6 weeks prior to that, as well as certain items that had been in the newspaper. By the end of the interrogation, I was curled up into a fetal position on the floor. I was crying uncontrollably. Needless to say, I was arrested. I was charged with a murder and rape. So before I went to trial, the results of the DNA test the results of a DNA test came in from the FBI lab, which showed that semen found in the victim didn't match. But rather than acknowledge they made a mistake, they instead continued prosecuting full speed ahead. This is where the prosecutorial misconduct and fraud by the medical examiner comes in. When the autopsy is done, there's audio and written notes which are taken contemporaneously as the findings are made, as a way of ensuring authenticity. So it was only 6 months after doing the autopsy that suddenly, for the first time, this medical examiner claimed that he found medical evidence to show that the victim, a 15-year-old immigrant from Colombia who had been in the country for about a year and a half, leading a really sheltered life, in which she really didn't go out anywhere unless she was accompanied by her older sister or her parents, that she had been sexually active, which is what opened the door for the prosecutor to argue that it didn't matter that the DNA didn't come from me because it could have come from somebody that she slept with close enough to the murder and rape so as to explain away the DNA. Basically, in order to wrongfully convict me, the prosecutor was willing to trash the reputation of the victim. Taking his lie a step further, he actually named another youth by name that he claimed had had sex with the victim. Yet he never had a DNA test result performed in order to prove that assertion. He didn't even call him as a witness to give verbal testimony. He just made the unsupported argument to the jury. At the same time, my public defender was terrible. He never interviewed nor called as a witness my alibi. I was actually playing wiffle ball at the time that the crime happened. When it was time to cross-examine the medical examiner and to discredit him, which would have been the right move in order to make the DNA evidence stand up, he instead stood up in open court and had a big smile on his face and said to the medical examiner that you're going to be pleased to know that I don't have a single question for you. He never explained to the jury the significance of the DNA not matching me. He never used that to argue that this so-called confession was coerced and false. He very rarely met with me. Whenever he would meet with me and I would try to explain to him that I was innocent and what had happened in the interrogation room, he was always shutting me up. One time he told me he didn't care if I was guilty or innocent. He wouldn't allow me to testify at the pre-trial hearing. See, the interrogation was not video or audio taped. It wasn't even a signed confession. It was just the cop's word. And so they were able to leave out the illegal things which they had done, specifically the threat and the false promise. So I wanted to take the stand and tell the judge what had happened, but my lawyer wouldn't allow me to. He told me that he hadn't decided if I was going to testify at the trial or not, and so he didn't want to have me under oath on the record saying what happened in the interrogation room, telling me that if he decided for me to testify at the trial, that the prior testimony could have been used against me. But that really didn't make any sense because, first of all, if the judge had believed me, then the statements would have been ruled as being involuntary, and therefore they would have been inadmissible, and lacking that, there would not have been any other evidence. But then if it really went that badly, I didn't have to take the stand at the trial, and so therefore the testimony could not have been used. But then when we got to the trial, he wouldn't allow me to testify there either. He told me that it wasn't his job to prove that I was innocent, it was up to the prosecution to prove that I was guilty, and he didn't think that that had happened. You might hear that in a classroom, it's a legal maxim, but that's not how it works in reality. If you find yourself charged with a crime, you have to do everything you can to prove that you're innocent, or else you run a risk of possibly being wrongfully convicted. My lawyer should have never represented me in the first place because of a conflict of interest, in that this other youth that the prosecution was falsely claiming had had sex with the victim was represented by another member of legal aid, which meant that the defense could not have asked for a DNA test, and we were not able to subpoena and call him as a witness in order to explode the consensual sex theory. Add it all up, I guess it's not too surprising that the jury found me guilty. I'll never forget the day I was found guilty. It felt like I was in some sort of nightmarish alternative reality, because to my way of thinking up until that point in time, only the guilty were convicted. Yet they said what they did, and I was taken into custody. Ultimately, I was given a 15 to life sentence, which I served in a men's maximum security prison. I lost all 7 of my appeals. I got turned down for parole. Ultimately, I was exonerated through further DNA testing with the assistance of the Innocence Project. So the Innocence Project agreeing to represent me was the first major break that I got. The second thing was that Pirro left office, and her successor, Janet T. Fiore, was willing to allow me to have further testing without having to litigate over it. And the third thing was that we got lucky that the actual perpetrator had committed a second murder 3.5 years later after killing the victim in my case, which resulted in his DNA being put in the data bank so that when I got the testing, it matched him. So after the DNA matched him, he confessed to both to the district attorney investigator as well as to a reporter on video camera. So that conviction was overturned September 20th, 2016, and I went back to court November 2nd, 2016, at which point all the charges against me were dismissed on actual innocence grounds. Changing gears, as Gary mentioned, you know, my life is an advocate's life now, and I regularly trade privacy in exchange for awareness. So speaking at events like this and doing media interviews, meeting with elected officials, really was a big part of what I did for the my first 5 years of freedom. Even while, you know, wrestling with trying to reintegrate back into a society that I really no longer recognized, even while dealing with the psychological after effects of my experience. So after about 5 years, I was able to receive some compensation, and I started a nonprofit organization whose goal is to exonerate other wrongfully convicted people. I named it after me, just intending for that to be a legacy. The Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice is what it's called. And I put $1.5 million of my own money into that. We've exonerated 2 people in our 4.5 years of existence. We got 3 other people released on parole whose innocence was fairly clear from the record, but we didn't have anything new to bring into court, so we're not in a position to exonerate them. But there's 5 people free as a result of the work that we do. So I just want to hit on some of the deficiencies that lead to wrongful convictions, and we know what those reforms are, because, you know, this event is Americans for Legal Reform. So it would be remiss of me not to mention some reforms. It needs to be a takeaway. It's not just to tell the story. I actually only tell the story to get to the deficiencies and the changes that are needed to prevent this from other people. So briefly, we need interrogations to be videotaped completely from beginning to end, because coerced false confessions have been the cause of wrongful convictions in 25% of the cases. The other reforms designed to prevent wrongful conviction by coerced false confession would include admission of false confession expert testimony into the courtroom. That's important because the general public think that innocent people would not falsely confess. The experts don't give an opinion on whether a confession is false or not. That's up to the jury or the court, but instead they provide contextual information as to what the factors are that could lead an innocent person to confess, so that the court could take that into account and determine whether a confession is false or not. Having a pretrial hearing where the accuracy of a confession is considered, not just whether or not something was voluntary or not. In terms of misidentification has been the cause of wrongful convictions in 75% of the DNA-proven wrongful convictions. Best practices in this area would include having everybody in the lineup or photo array resemble the description given by a witness, telling the witness that the actual perpetrator may not necessarily be in the lineup or photo array, so that there isn't an undue level of confidence. Taking a confident statement, asking a witness, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you of your identification? That's important to collect that, because by the time a trial rolls around, a witness would have been prepped several times and testified in several having the usage of the double blind method so that the officer doing the lineup or photo array doesn't actually know who's suspected, so inadvertent cues or clues couldn't be given. Videotaping the process so that we don't have to rely just on testimony. Letting the witness know that if an identification is not made, that the investigation will continue so that nobody feels pressed to make an identification lest the perpetrator escape justice. And lastly, whoever's doing the photo array or lineup should not can give a congratulatory statement at the end of the procedure, because that has the impact of bolstering the confidence level of the witness. Prosecutorial misconduct is a major cause of wrongful conviction. Here I advocate for a few things. Definitely the Commission on Prosecutorial Conduct, which the advocacy group, the umbrella organization It Can Happen to You, has been spearheading, along with the support of many other organizations and people. Basically, there should be like a committee that's similar to the Commission on Judicial Conduct. Right now, there is no independent oversight board, and they don't have ability to investigate allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. They'd have subpoena power. They could recommend from a menu of consequences, from a reprimand to actual removal from being in office. So that's one aspect of it. Removal of prosecutorial immunity. You know, prosecutor is one of the few professions where you can break the law and there's no consequences. Police don't have that type of immunity, and they're not hindered from doing their job. They just don't violate somebody's rights. You don't have to worry about being a defendant. And I think when there's clear-cut, intentional prosecutorial misconduct, there should be things like withholding evidence of innocence, threatening witnesses, either with the charges or threatening removal of kids, working hand in glove with experts. Tell me what you want to prove, and I'll prove it. I think when that happens and an innocent person goes to prison, then there should be criminal consequence. That should be a crime, because as far as I'm concerned, that's a kidnapping, you know, done under color of law, using the system. So, we need to have better system of defense. The public defender system is broken. If you can afford a lawyer and you have political connections, then you're okay. But for most of us, that's not what our reality is. We need to have one statewide system so there could be oversight and quality control. We need to limit the caseload. It's not unusual for one attorney to represent 100 people at the same time. We need to have equal financial resources and manpower between the public defender's office and the prosecutor's office. And we need to have equal pay for both sides. I think it's the wrong message to give a prosecutor starting salaries more than what a public defender's is. I mean, we're saying that they're doing a more important job. It's another inequity. We need to have safeguards in place. Incentivized witnessing, which is when someone gets a benefit for testimony that's been a cause of wrongful convictions in 15% of the cases. So here the reforms would be, if we're going to allow the so-called jailhouse confessions, then we need to people need to wear wires so we can be sure that these incriminating conversations actually take place as opposed to being fabricated. There should be an external evidence requirement, meaning that nobody should be allowed to be convicted based only on an informant. There should be at least one piece of evidence required beyond that. And so with that, I'm going to end and.
Tell me about your family, the disassociative aspect of that many years and how it broke your family real quick.
Okay, so I'm being asked to share just on the human interest side of things. One of the after effects is in terms of trying to put your life back together again. There's definitely a crossover into the family. You know, it's I've talked to a lot of people, and then also using myself as example is it's very difficult to reconnect with your family after you spent really many years away from them with limited to no contact in many cases. I'm certainly a different person than what I was before, and as are members of my family. So it's hard to reconnect. So when I meet up with them, it's some kind of an awkward experience at times because I know who they are intellectually and I have memories from when I was younger, but there is that really long gap, and so it's still kind of somewhat of an awkward thing. So there's a lot of implications for everybody. The community was in danger when the actual criminal was left free, and certainly that didn't bring any closure to the actual victim's family to have the wrong person in there and then Then there's a second victim's family, who the family of the second victim, who the actual criminal killed 3.5 years later. So with that, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Americans for Legal Reform for putting on this event tonight and having me back to speak.
Long Island Backstory. Chief Correspondent Gary Jacobs is uncovering the truth on Long Island. The family court system. Red light cameras. Corruption in local politics. The heroin epidemic. Corrupt judges. At Long Island Backstory, we uncover the truth that the Cablevision news monopoly won't dare touch. We uncover the details you won't see on News 12 or in Newsday. We are local independent media at its best. Long Island Backstory, available on public access TV and on YouTube.
Todd's a great guy. I mean, look at him. What a sweetheart. Attaboy. Wait, Todd, what are you doing? How totally selfish and un-Todd-like of you. Come on, Todd. Come on, man.
Long Island Backstory. Long Island Backstory.
They said I couldn't dream. Called me a piece of trash and swore that's all I'd ever be. Said a bottle couldn't see the ocean. Give up. Go back to the dumpster. But I didn't listen. I made my way. And now, I am what I've always wanted to be.